que con combatientes cubanos podrá contar el movimiento revolucionario en cualquier rincón de la tierra.
Hello, my friends. Today's going to be a great episode. We're going to go over the legal cluster mess between our country and the country of Cuba. I'll talk about how we got Guantanamo Bay and what Fidel Castro, how he got in power and what he did to the United States relations with Cuba. And it's a very interesting kind of the history of Cuba going back centuries all relates to why the current situation between the United States and Cuba is the way it is. You're going to love this episode. I can't wait to have it with you. How you doing, my good friends? It's great to have you all back. As always, I've been hearing a lot from the fans out there, and I always enjoy it. So yeah, when I was a kid, my first introduction to Cuba was Tony Montana.
I'm Tony Montana, a political prisoner from Cuba.
You know who that is, right? Zeke of the Scarface movie. You know that, and very good baseball players from Cuba. Who's like Yasiel Puig is the current, and then I watched Godfather 2, and but anyway, my friends that are really into cigars, I'm not that into cigars, but my friends that are very, very into cigars say that the cigars from Cuba are overrated. They say like the cigars from the Dominican Republic is just as good or a lot better, and it's like a novelty to get it from Cuba, but it's not anything worth writing home about. I don't know. Jose Canseco's is Cuban? I did not know. I didn't even see what I mean. The Cuban?
Yeah, the sandwich.
Oh, the Cuban sandwich? And by the way, so Christopher Columbus in 1492 did not get to the United States of America. He did get to Cuba. All right. He landed in the Bahamas and Cuba in 1492. And then America was discovered. I love saying that. America was discovered. Hey, there's a great bit on The Sopranos about this whole Christopher Columbus and coming to America and all that good jazz. But no, he didn't make it to the United States of America. He did make it to the Bahamas and Cuba. And a lot of the kind of the modern day history starts with that. There were a lot of natives that lived in Cuba. Sadly, they all died, like little by little, or I should say a lot by a lot, measles and smallpox and other diseases that were brought from the Europeans. So what happened was, as Cuba was discovered by Christopher Columbus, it became a part of the Kingdom of Spain. And that this is, like I said, in 1492. And it's really funny, all of the current laws and all of the United States relations with Cuba and everything, like none of it is an accident. All of it relates to what happened. So as a lawyer, I always like to know the historical context. And that's how I kind of like realize, oh, that's why these treaties are written this way. And this is why this type of legal case against a Cuban corporation is handled this way. So you'll understand what I mean as I kind of go over this, the historical context. But yeah, The Sopranos did do a good bit on Christopher Columbus.
He discovered America is what he did. He was a brave Italian explorer. And in this house, Christopher Columbus is a hero.
And then in the 1500s, from it was part of the Kingdom of Spain, there was a lot of land and a lot of farming opportunities. And then so the Europeans brought a lot of slaves from Africa into Cuba, and they started working in Cuba. So the Spaniards had control of Cuba for centuries. And in the mid 1700s, there was a war. The Spanish and French fought a war with England. And there that spilled into the Caribbean Sea and the Bahamas. So the war between those European countries had a great effect here in the Caribbean Sea. I talk about it like we're in the Caribbean right now, but you know what I'm saying, here in the Americas. The England more or less won that war, and then they signed a treaty. Get this, you guys ready for this? In the treaty, the 1763 Treaty of Paris, there was an agreement that England would take Florida and Spain would keep Cuba. So that was kind of like, in Monopoly, you kind of trade, right? So England agreed to take Florida and give Spain, let Spain keep Cuba. That was in the treaty. I don't know. I think England got the raw end of that deal. What do you think? I would take Cuba over Florida. What about you, Mateo? What would you, Yeah. So England took Florida. Probably some of it had to do with the fact that the Spaniards were already in Cuba, so they already kind of had a control there and an infrastructure there, whereas England didn't. Like, even though England attacked Cuba and like took over, but in the treaty though, so it went back to Spain. Can you imagine if those few people that were making those decisions, if they decided otherwise, right? And England takes Cuba and Spain takes Florida, like how different everything would be, right? Anyhow, but that's how it landed. Finally, there's the Spanish-American War, where the United States got in a war with Spain, and a lot of it was over this land in Cuba. The U.S. won that war and got Cuba as a protectorate. So Cuba then became a part of the United States. Same with Puerto Rico. This is why we have Guantanamo Bay, all right, is because of this war. We win this war, and then we get kind of Cuba as a protectorate. And then the United States made a treaty with Cuba saying, okay, we'll let you become independent, but we're going to keep a big chunk of land, and that's going to be our land. It's going to be Guantanamo Bay. So it's in Cuba, but it's American property. And in the 1903, the United States and Cuba signed a lease agreement, like for an apartment. But this this is for a serious part of land in Cuba. The lease agreement said, for a few gold coins per year, we're going to occupy and take hold of Guantanamo Bay. And to this day, they still pay a few gold coins a year. The lease, you ever sign a lease agreement to live somewhere? Yeah. Right? It's always like, what was it, a 1-year lease, a month to month? 9 months okay. This is a forever lease. Like, it just lasts forever, as long as they pay a couple gold coins a year. This was in the 1903 lease agreement. I've always said, like, I want to sign a lease agreement like that, where I get like something forever just for 2 gold coins a year. So that was obviously not an accident. That was fought over, and there was a whole full-blown war for that. And then in exchange for giving the Cuban independence, the United States got this awesome lease agreement deal for Guantanamo Bay. And are we still in Guantanamo Bay? Yes, obviously, right? And after 9/11 and everything, right? Where were the detainees sent? They were sent to Guantanamo Bay. Speaking of, this is, again, why I always say, if you want to understand the law, you have to understand the history. There was all these Supreme Court cases, and part of it was because the United States had all these detainees. They were taking them to Guantanamo Bay. And then those detainees had, the lawyers that said, wait a minute, there's not a trial. These people aren't getting they're getting denied the right to a speedy trial. They're getting denied the right to a jury trial before they're held indefinitely like this. So the United States government said, but wait a minute, they're not in the United States. Like, they're in Cuba, right? Because that is not part of our country. It's only a part that we're temporarily leasing forever. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's not like these folks are United States citizens and that this is happening in the United States. It's happening in a foreign country of Cuba. And who won that? Guess who won that? The United States government won that, Had they brought those detainees to Florida or, the mainland United States, then it could have been different. But instead, based on this lease agreement and the fact that it's not technically our property, even though we control it and everything, but we're just leasing it. Like when you lease the apartment.
I got to try that excuse,
Yeah. When you lease the apartment, was it yours? Did you own it? No, you were just temporarily using it. So this is the argument of the United States, one of the arguments that they had with the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, well, you're right. Historically, the detainees are not here. Okay. After that, throughout the 1900s, the United States had a lot of interest, and they were kind of running the government, the economy. Running the economy, and it was some historians say about 80% of all of the economy in Cuba during the 1900s had United States interest in it. The reason why that's important is because after the United States, after Fidel Castro came in power and kicked out all the United States interest, This is where all of these lawsuits to this day happened, all right? And it's amazing to me how this goes down, all right? So the Cuban government, everything was going fine. Then there's the Great Depression. The Great Depression, a new guy, there was a revolution in the 30s in Cuba. A new guy comes over, Batista. He takes over and becomes the leader of Cuba. He is a United States kind of puppet. And he's the one that was there for about 20 years. And then our friend, not a friend, but Fidel Castro comes, starts growing up and saying, this guy is corrupt. This guy is a capitalist. He's taking advantage of the workers. He's like this United States puppet. So in 1953, what Fidel Castro and his brother Raul and their buddy Che Guevara, what they end up doing in the 50s is just, I don't know why there's not more movies or stories about this, because it's pretty freaking awesome. Okay, so in 1953, they get a group of people and they attack the military in Cuba, the Batista's people, and they get the you-know-what beat out of them, like completely beat out of them. It was on July 26, 1953. The reason why that date is important is because then it started what they called the 26th of July movement. So they get the you-know-what beat out of them when they attack these barracks in Cuba. And then for some crazy reason, the Cuban government kept Fidel Castro in a prison for 2 years and then just kicked him out of the country. You know what I think they should have? They should have been a little bit more Machiavellian, in retrospect. I bet you Batista, and one day after he got disposed, he said, I should have just killed him while I had him in prison. That's what most dictators do. Dang it. No, I'm just joking. But he didn't. He let him live. They kick him out of the country. And then in the mid 50s, this is to me, this is shocking. Okay. So Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, they get together exactly. There's 81 of them, just 81 guys that are meeting in Mexico. And I love this. I read this autobiography of Fidel Castro, and he talks about all these meetings where it's like they're in Mexico and all of these former Cuban, residents who were exiled and all these other, they got some people from Mexico, and Che Guevara himself was from Argentina. So they get together. They said, we want to overthrow the government of Cuba. All right, that's kind of a big deal, 81 guys together. Nowadays, you get 81 guys together and be like, let's get the iPhone to work a little faster. You know what I'm saying? Let's get the charge on the iPhone to go instead of 7 hours, 7 hours and 4 minutes. These 81 guys, right, they get together and they say, we're going to take over Cuba. All right. They scrap the money they have together and they buy this piece of crap old yacht, old boat. They called it the Grandma, or whoever owned it before. This is it. This is a picture of it. This little yacht, I don't know why they call it a yacht. It was just a big boat. But this big boat changed the whole history of Cuba. These 81 guys, they get together, they scrap all the money they have together, they buy this boat, and then they get some ammunition together. Some of them knew something about military, things like that. They scrap all of this together, and then they sail from Mexico to Cuba. Supposed to take 5 days. Instead, it took 7 days. And it was so bad, the boat was leaky. Some of the problems that they had is they had to get literal buckets and get the water out. So if this boat was just a little bit leakier than it was, then everything could have been different. You know what I'm saying? Isn't that nuts? To me, that's nuts. Okay. So anyway, they finally make it to Cuba. They lost a couple people on the way. That's how bad the voyage was. One guy fell overboard and because it was so rocky, they couldn't even get the boat to steer right. So they finally get to Cuba, and then they're like, we're gonna fight the whole government. In less than 2 weeks, there was only 19 of them left. All right, that's how bad it was. Only 19 of them left. So now we're down to just 19 guys, and then they somehow win this whole war and take over all of Cuba. 19 guys, and I'll tell you how they did it. It was all guerrilla warfare, but what they did is when they would go to different farms, and instead of just killing people, they would talk to them and get them on their side. At some points they captured a few soldiers, and instead of holding them prisoner or killing them or doing whatever, they actually convinced them to be on their side. This is where Che Guevara and his charisma, what do they call that nowadays? The Riz? He had Riz. Apparently Fidel Castro had Riz. Kids, you got to have Riz, right? They had Riz. So with their charisma, they, instead of taking these people over. They would go there and they said, why don't you join our side? This is what we're trying to do. We're communists. We're going to make sure the workers are fed right and taken care of and all that jazz. And Batista, the leader, is taking over. So they went from 19 to thousands and thousands. And they did this little by little. Long story short, even though I could talk about this for hours because I love this stuff, but they took over all of Cuba. By 1959, it was like 2.5 years later, they took over all of Cuba and they got rid of the then president. And then how it relates to today is that then Fidel Castro said, who was running the economy? United States, right? And so now Fidel Castro said one of the first edicts he did was he said, I'm going to get rid of all of United States interest here. So he just kicked out the U.S. bank, kicked out the U.S. landowners, kicked out the U.S. interest in Cuba, just by law, just like signing it off, saying this is no longer the case. Like now it's all going to be owned by Cubans. And maybe the USSR. So, all right. So anyway, then this is the only reason there was an embargo against Cuba. It wasn't because of some sort of, we didn't like Fidel Castro. Oh, well, we did. Always keep your phone on silent when you do a podcast. Sorry about that. Do you get these yeah, the ghost of Fidel Castro? Man, I get all these calls from people, like you get these spam calls. Give me all your money. You're like, all that crap. You get those? Yeah, I get those too. But then I just block my wife from calling me. Sorry. That was a joke. Okay. I better keep my phone on silent. Are we going to keep that or should we kick that? We'll debate that later. We'll debate that.
Back up, though. This is the reason.
Oh, this is why we had the trade embargo. It was nothing to do. Okay. I mean, yes. Fidel Castro, when he came to power, he killed a lot of the former Batista rulers and their infrastructure and all of that. But that's not why. That was just the stated reason. And it had nothing to do with him being a communist. It was just that he kicked out the United States interest. So a lot of corporations lost a lot of money. And because of that was this embargo that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis because Fidel Castro got in bed with the USSR. He, it led to this. America tried. We got all of these soldiers together and they tried to overthrow Fidel Castro. It was called the Bay of Pigs incident in 1962. So, or it could have been 1963. But what happened at this time was that interest since then has not gone away. You know what's weird about American corporations is they don't forget when they lose billions of dollars. Isn't that nuts? They don't even forget when I owe them $10. I get the freaking letter, right? Joe Samo, you owe us $10. Here, they lost billions of dollars. The United States then made federal laws saying that all of these corporations that lost money to Cuba can file lawsuits and keep their interest, okay? But it wasn't helpful because Fidel Castro was the leader, and it wasn't like he's going to say, "Oh, United States lawsuit saying that this corporation should get back, 25 square miles of Havana." No way, right? They're not going to go to war over it. Apparently, right? They're going to. So it wasn't. These relations with Cuba became strained because of this reason, and then the United States started passing laws saying, okay, all of these companies and all these people that lost money when Fidel Castro came to power, they can keep their lawsuit and they can keep the interest, meaning you can file a lawsuit later if you want. And if we ever make good relations with Cuba, we'll try to get this sorted out so you can get some of your money back for the big corporations. Obama had good relations with Fidel Castro. And do you remember, we can actually go to Cuba now and visit. You know why? It was Obama. Obama then, they entered into treaties where they would allow the Cuban government agreed to give some of this money back. And in exchange, it eased the restrictions against the Cubans. And Obama did a lot of that. So by easing those restrictions, then we were allowed to visit Cuba. You could buy Cuban cigars now, even though it's a little taboo still. But it was those easing of sanctions because then the American corporations, the lawsuits that they filed, then Cuba started kind of recognizing some of them, paying some of them back. You know what I'm saying? It was just that kind of that money thing that loosened it a little bit. But the problem to this day, and the reason why the Cuban the relationship between the United States and Cuba isn't very good still, is that if they were to make good on all of that, they would have to basically give Cuba back to the United States. Do you know what I'm saying? Because what did I say earlier, in the 1900s, it was something like 80%. Historians say like maybe 80% of the economy was driven by United States corporations in Cuba. And so if they were to make good to all of those corporations that lost all of the property and the land there, then Cuba would be giving back Cuba to America, right? Which they're not going to agree to do. But they did a little bit. So a little bit of the sanctions kind of cleared, but it's not completely cleared. How are we going to resolve this problem? All these treaties. Yeah, it's not. Come on, Mateo. We got plenty of time. I got all the time in the world. I got till 10 p.m. tonight, and it's only noon. Yeah, I think it's going to be a tough one. I don't know how that. Well, this is why the ambassadors and the government relations, and this is kind of the Cubans, when things were very bad there, and a lot of them would come to the United States, it's because the sanctions were so brutal that then in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I mean, the economy was miserable in Cuba. They couldn't trade. They were like isolated, right? And so a lot of the migrants that came from Cuba was because of this. And Fidel Castro was a very, very harsh leader because he had to keep his control for all those decades. But I don't know. I mean, obviously, I don't know. I'm just a lawyer. I love saying that. It's my cop out for almost everything. Hey, I'm just giving you the history and the legal issues here. There are, I think, those lawsuits. I think sooner or later, there has to be some sort of amnesty or kind of like you lost out. End of story. You can't, not everyone can be made whole, which is weird because the American government wants those corporations, because those corporations, all these decades, they've been lobbying to keep these sanctions and pressure on Cuba so that they can get their money back. Do you know what I'm saying? But the problem is Cuba won't agree. So either we have to take over Cuba like the good old days, or we have to just let this go. It's easy for Mateo and Zeke to say, let's just let it go. What did you lose? See, this guy's like laughing, right? He didn't lose nothing. I didn't lose nothing either. So to me, it's so wrong. But if you lost a lot of money, right, and you're a big shot corporation, you're not going to agree. In Godfather 2, this is part of they were running these resorts and casinos in Cuba, which is true. American corporations were running resorts and casinos in Cuba. But that's where, when Fidel Castro came, they kicked them all out. Those interests, the beauty of those interests is that they've stayed. And sometimes corporations, what they'll do is they'll take that interest. Let's say it's like, look, on paper, we lost $48 million in 1964 in Cuba. We will sell that interest for $4 million. And some other company takes it, and then that company keeps that interest and then sells it, and then it stays around. And to this day, 2024, right? Those interests are still there. They don't go away. And those interests are lobbying Congress to keep the sanctions on Cuba, which keeps Cuba poor. And then all these migrants come to America. Wow, what a cluster mess, dude. What's the answer? I don't know. But I do know it's an interesting topic. I am just a lawyer. If you have any interest in Cuba, no, I'm just joking. I doubt I'm going to get a call from someone saying, I lost all this property in Cuba. Can you get it back for me, Joe Samo? I could get you a judgment saying Cuba owes you a bunch of money. But I don't know how to enforce that judgment. It would have to be some sort of treaty where the United States says, okay, can you enforce these judgments? They said something like, if a judgment is under $100,000, can you pay this? If it's a lawsuit over 6,000, then you could sue in the federal court. Like they made some, all these treaties, but we could get a judgment. I'm joking. I'm not anticipating anyone calling, but American lawyers could get a judgment saying Cuba owes you all this money. But the real question is, the only way to enforce it is if Cuba agrees to pay it with the United States, some sort of treaty. And if they do that, they'll get rid of the sanctions maybe, but then they'll give all of Cuba back to America, which they're not going to do. If you have any questions, I love this kind of stuff. And this is a different episode. Usually, obviously, I go over some sort of like very specific lawsuit, or a Donald Trump lawsuit, which I'm sick of doing, but he just gets involved in so many lawsuits. This one was obviously a lot different, kind of going over the history of Cuba and kind of giving you the framework as to why there was these sanctions and why Cuba was so isolated and the kind of the picture of the current legal affairs between the U.S. and Cuba. Let's do a little joke here. Something Mateo wanted us to watch. God, Satan, and the engineer.
An engineer dies and goes to hell. Dissatisfied with the level of comfort, he starts designing and building improvements. And after a while, hell has air conditioning, ice water, flushing toilets, and escalators. The engineer is really popular now. One day, God asks Satan, "So how are things going down there?" Satan says, "Well, things are going great. We've now got air conditioning, ice water, flushing toilets, and escalators. There's no telling what this engineer is going to come up with next. He's simply brilliant." God, clearly horrified, says to the Satan, "What? You've got an engineer? That's clearly a mistake. He should never have gone down there. You know all engineers go to heaven. Send him up here immediately." Satan says, "No way. I really like having an engineer on the staff, so I'm keeping him." God says, "Send him back up here, or I'll sue you." "Yeah, right," Satan says, laughing. "And just where the hell are you going to get a lawyer?"
Yes, all lawyers go to hell. It's just a rule. Why do people hate lawyers so much? I think I know why. I mean, we're just miserable. Like I have a joke, like personal injury law. Like I do a lot of personal injury law, which reminds me. Have you been injured in an auto accident? Call Joe Samo at 619-672-1741. No, I mean, the joke here I have with personal injury lawyers is personal injury lawyers just love it when someone gets in a car crash. And one of my jokes I used to tell, it's like, "Oh my God, my friend Steve, he comes up to me, he's like, 'Oh man, I got good news, I got bad news.' Like, okay, give it to me. Good news, my cousin got in a major car crash. Wow! Bad news, he's okay." Right? We're going to hell, because if he's okay, there's no loss. You're doing insurance, Zeke, right? There's no lawsuit if he's okay. Zeke's looking at me like, see what I'm saying? That's why. Zeke's my buddy, and he's looking at me like, man, Joe Samo can't go to hell fast enough. All right. That was a good joke. I like that, Mateo. All right, good stuff. See you next week.